Tonight, it's one of the greatest mysteries we've ever faced. Where did the deadly virus that shut down the world come from? Did it actually emerge in a bat-infested copper mine 8 years ago in remote southwest China, where 3 men who worked there died of a disease almost identical to COVID-19? And what happened to the infected human blood samples when they were brought here to a laboratory in Wuhan, in the city at the centre of the COVID crisis? What are the chances, and where are the answers? It's been the forbidden question, but does the world have the right to ask? Did COVID-19 come from a lab? Tonight, as the World Health Organization prepares to release its report into the origins of the virus, we'll investigate the pandemic.
Bats is where we start.
Yes.
The claims of cover-up and conspiracy, of opportunism and payback, and the condemnation.
The China virus, the China plague.
Kung flu.
Has China been unfairly damned? Or has it known the truth about the virus all along?
The independent expert team to study the origins of the COVID-19 virus has completed its trip to China.
Good evening, I'm Liz Hayes, and this is Under Investigation.
Joining me tonight, Mary Louise McLaws, Professor of Epidemiology at New South Wales University, who is an advisor to the World Health Organization on infection prevention and control.
If this has leaked out from the laboratory, you have to look at what was the transmissibility of it.
Jason Yat-Sen Lee, successful Australian businessman and human rights lawyer. He is the son of Hong Kong migrants.
It is literally like we're building the Death Star.
Bates Gill, Professor of Asia-Pacific Security Studies at Macquarie University.
COVID-19 simply intensified what was already well in motion. The suspicions of China and the Chinese suspicions of the West.
Jackson Ryan, doctor and global science editor of CNET, the world's largest tech website.
Was it kind of like mind-blowing to you that there's this research being undertaken?
Yeah, I don't think many people know about this.
I'm just so disturbed.
Nikolai Petrovsky, Professor of Medicine at Flinders University, who's working on a COVID vaccine, but who has also conducted research which he says indicates the virus came from a laboratory.
Why did the world not take this seriously? Because they were misinformed.
And from Shanghai, we're joined by Professor Chen Hong, Director of Australian Studies at the East China Normal University.
I think this is quite unfair to say that actually China was deliberately withholding the facts.
Thank you all so much for joining us. I'm going to start with you, Nikolai. Do you think that this virus could well have come from a laboratory?
We cannot exclude a laboratory origin of the virus. It's possible that it came from a zoonotic transmission from an animal to a human, but it's equally plausible that it may have come from an accidental leak of a virus that was being grown in a laboratory.
You've got 2 competing theories here. You've got what Nikolai's talking about, an accidental leak, or you've got an accidental jump from a bat, an intermediate species, into a human. In both cases, I still actually think it's accidental.
The big debate over the origin of the virus, which is dividing the scientific and political world, starts in a remote, abandoned copper mine in southwest China 8 years ago, where a coronavirus very similar to the one that causes COVID-19 was found in bats.
It's 2012. The abandoned mine is near the tiny town of Tugun, deep in China's southwest Yunnan province. Unknown to the men working there, the bats populating the mine and the bat feces they were shoveling contained an unknown coronavirus that would later be named RATG13. Coronaviruses are a large family of viruses that attack the upper respiratory tract. Around 2 weeks after entering the mine, the miners fell sick with a strange flu-like illness. These Chinese medical records, kept secret for years, showed their symptoms were identical to COVID-19.
The symptoms of the infection that they got in that mine, they were things like dry cough, there were high fevers.
Dr. Jonathan Latham is Executive Director of the Bioscience Resource Project in New York.
All of those symptoms, we would recognize them today as COVID-19 symptoms, pretty diagnostic. If you showed up at a hospital or a doctor's office with those symptoms, they would have you nailed down as a COVID patient.
3 of the 6 infected miners died, one lingering in hospital for 5 months before succumbing to the strange illness. Time enough, according to Dr. Latham's research, for the bat virus infecting the sick miner to mutate into a coronavirus that was now capable of being passed on to other humans. And so scientists began to ask, were these men the first victims of COVID-19, 8 years before it erupted in Wuhan?
What we're suggesting is that the length of time that these miners were in the hospital, they were basically incubating this virus for a very long time. And so that gave the virus an opportunity to evolve, to adapt to human lungs.
Blood samples from the dying miners were sent to China's highest security biolab, 1,500 kilometres to the north, to the Wuhan Institute of Virology.
They had tests that they sent to the Wuhan Institute of Virology, which tested positive for a coronavirus.
And samples of the bat coronavirus taken from the feces in the mine were also taken to the Wuhan lab. Comparison tests would later reveal it was a 96% match to COVID-19. The virus that first struck in Wuhan in December 2019.
The very simple data elements on the ground all point to the likelihood that this virus came from a lab.
As the world seeks answers about the origins of the virus, what was once dismissed as a conspiracy theory has become a legitimate scientific debate. Is it possible that COVID-19 already existed and was being researched and accidentally escaped from the Wuhan lab, sparking the pandemic? But it's a debate many scientists reject.
The lab-based scenarios are all conspiracy theories because they propose that there's a scientist somewhere, and not just one scientist, but a group of scientists who are covering up. That is the essence of a conspiracy theory.
Dr. Robert Garry is Professor of Microbiology and Immunology at Tulane Medical School in New Orleans. He agrees there is evidence that the Wuhan Institute of Virology was carrying out research on the bat coronavirus called RATG13 and on samples from the dead miners. But he says it's scientifically impossible for the bat virus to have mutated into COVID-19 either in the lab or in the bodies of the dying miners.
The theory of Latham that RATG13 somehow evolved in some of the miners that got sick is also not feasible, not plausible. That would take about 50 years of natural evolution.
The way to think about this is to say, if all the evidence that was in favor of a lab escape was in favor of a natural origin, and the amount of evidence there was in favor of a natural origin was on the side of a lab escape, there would be no disagreement about what happened here.
Nikolai? Bats is where we start.
Yes, we do know that these coronaviruses are in bats. So how did it cross from a bat to a human? A virus that's optimised to infect a bat is not optimised to infect a human. So often they'll come via intermediary species. For COVID-19, there is no evidence of an animal that sits between us and the bats.
And is that why you feel there are compelling reasons to feel it's come from a laboratory?
I think it would be wrong to shut down one line of that questioning and say that's conspiracy theory, only leaving us with the one possibility, which is it came from an animal. As a scientist, we have to explore both possibilities until we can at least exclude one, and we can't do that right now. What we do know is that the miners appeared to have antibodies against a coronavirus, but it doesn't tell you what coronavirus.
Can I also say it also doesn't tell you that that was cause of their death or their infection, because you may get antibodies because you've been exposed, but it doesn't mean you've got disease.
Except in this case, I mean, you know, I've read the medical thesis, and I guess I'm a doctor myself, and what's described there, both the patient's symptoms, the course of the disease, their biochemistry and the serology says these miners were infected with a coronavirus.
We're stopped by the police, lying in wait for us. This is a system that doesn't care for questions.
Attempts by international journalists to visit the copper mine in China have been thwarted. It's only added to suspicions that authorities there don't want outsiders investigating this highly contentious theory.
At the time, the bat virus, RATG13, was found in the copper mine, the most secure laboratory in China for the study and containment of viruses was the Wuhan Institute of Virology.
It was, and still is, run by Shi Zhangli, who's known as the Batwoman because of her work with bat diseases, and who has confirmed that she did take samples of the copper mine virus to study in Wuhan. But it's the type of research that was taking place here that raises eyebrows and adds weight to the theory that COVID-19 came from this laboratory. It involved the manipulation of viruses for research, which made them incredibly dangerous. Raina McIntyre is Professor of Global Biosecurity at the New South Wales University. She says the bat virus that infected the miners in the copper mine could have been deliberately mutated into COVID-19 through the controversial and risky research technique called gain-of-function engineering.
The genetic engineering of a pathogen can be done in different ways. One way of doing it is called gain-of-function research, which is where you pass the virus through an animal host over and over again. So you're basically speeding up nature. You're like speeding up evolution by hundreds or thousands of years. That's, a well-established technique.
Shi Zhangli has confirmed that she and her team conducted gain-of-function engineering on bat coronaviruses at the Wuhan Institute of Virology.
Nikolai, gain-of-function engineering for the layman.
So essentially, we take a virus that we consider to be a potential threat, say an influenza virus from birds. We know that the Spanish flu that killed potentially hundreds of millions of people in 1918 came from a bird virus that crossed over to humans. So we have a whole lot of other bird and influenza viruses which don't cross over to humans. So the idea here is to try and create one that does. So essentially we harvest an influenza virus from current birds that isn't causing a pandemic, and we now try to insert genetic features into that virus that now would enable it to cause a human pandemic.
Scientifically, what's the gain? What's the good bit about that?
Well, the gain is understanding the enemy. Viruses out there in the wild are our enemy. So the idea here is that by studying the enemy and even manipulating the enemy to see how it could be even stronger, maybe that will help us in defending ourselves against the enemy. There's some who say the risk is we now have created something that didn't exist in nature, which is a highly lethal human virus. And if that was to leak, we have devastation.
This is like a really important issue in general, not just around coronavirus. I saw Jason sort of shaking his head, kind of being like, was it kind of like mind-blowing to you that there's this research being undertaken?
Yeah, I don't think many people know about this.
I'm just so disturbed that this goes on, and I don't think it should go on because it's just so intrinsically dangerous. If we are engineering a virus that could wipe out humankind, it is literally like we're building the Death Star, and if something goes wrong, then everybody dies. I mean, I find it shocking.
I think gain-of-function engineering, this engineering, which is horrific in your mind and mine too, that is banned, isn't it, in Western laboratories?
It was outlawed in the United States. It's now been actually brought in. Interestingly, when it was banned in the United States, the research was actually moved to the Wuhan Institute of Virology because it wasn't banned in China. And so, in fact, at one point, the US government was funding the gain-of-function research that we've seen published from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. But it is a fact that it is legal to undertake this research currently in pretty well most countries of the world.
Coming up,
I don't think the wet market is the origin of the pandemic.
investigating the Wuhan laboratory
This is not an independent organization nor an independent investigation.
and scientific debate shut down by the denier-in-chief.
There's nothing positive about what happened in China.
If we can discredit him for saying that, we can discredit him for a lot of other things.
That's next on Under Investigation. A coronavirus found in bats in a remote Chinese copper mine kills 3 miners in 2012. Their illness eerily similar to COVID-19. The virus samples are studied in the biohazard laboratory in the city where the pandemic first broke, Wuhan. The Wuhan lab has been conducting highly risky research designed to genetically engineer highly lethal human viruses in order to study them.
It is literally like we're building the Death Star.
So, could COVID-19 have accidentally leaked from this laboratory?
We cannot exclude a laboratory origin of the virus. I think it would be wrong to shut down one line of that questioning and say that's conspiracy theory.
The World Health Organization, the WHO, is the United Nations watchdog body tasked with sorting out fact from fiction. Its final report into the origin of the virus is to be released this week. New South Wales University epidemiologist Professor Mary Louise McLaws is an advisor to the WHO.
The big deal about the lab is to try and determine the possibilities, I guess, isn't it, Mary Louise?
If this has leaked out from the laboratory, you have to look at what was the transmissibility of it, how many people would it leak out into, or would it leak out into some sort of cloud to be able to become an enormous problem by January. So that leak would have to have then caused an enormous number of people to be exposed.
And it would have to have been covered up.
Yes, it would have to be covered up, but I don't get the sense that China has wanted to cover up because they really want to protect their population.
The WHO investigative team travelled to Wuhan earlier this year and included Australian professor Dominic Dwyer. When I spoke to him while he was in Wuhan, he said he believed the lab was definitely part of their mission. You go with an open mind and you follow the science. Does that open mind include ruling out or ruling in a leak from the Wuhan lab?
The laboratory leak is a very reasonable hypothesis because it's happened before throughout history and in many countries. So these things can happen. Then you've got to look at, well, what sort of leak was it? Was it one of the viruses that they had in the lab and accidentally was transmitted? Or was there perhaps more sinister research and so on done? They're all being considered.
What would you consider to be a failure? What would you say will be the problem if you come away from there not feeling like you've achieved what you needed to?
I think the failure would be that if we didn't get the information we request. I think the failure is if we don't get the cooperation that we as an expert group think we need. If that's refused, ultimately, then that would be a problem.
On February 9, after scarcely 2 weeks on the ground in Wuhan, WHO team leader Peter Ben Embarek initially announced the lab leak theory would not be investigated.
It was very unlikely that anything could escape from such a place.
The origin of the virus is now viewed as political dynamite, and the WHO has been accused of having a history of not wanting to upset China. That view was not helped when at the same press conference, Chinese scientists were allowed to promote the widely debunked claim that COVID-19 was brought into China in frozen food.
SARS-CoV-2 can persist in conditions found in frozen food, packaging and cold chain products. In that case, indicating that it can be carried long distance on cold chain products.
The reaction by many was to brand the WHO mission a whitewash, and later some scientists on the Wuhan team reported deep frustrations in their attempts to obtain any detailed data from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. But less than a week later, in a complete turnaround, the head of the WHO, Dr. Tedros Ghebreyesus, went public, stating that all theories for the origin of the virus would be investigated for their final report.
I wish to confirm that all hypotheses remain open and require further analysis and studies. And we will continue working to get the information we need to answer the questions that still need to be answered.
What would you like the WHO team to be able to get hold of?
Well, I would like them to be able to get hold to essentially all the lab books and records of the various committees within the Institute that would outline exactly what the experiments done were and which viruses they were handling. And I think, to be totally transparent, that's what I would like to see the WHO have free and unlimited access to.
Let's make a quick comment here about the WHO. I agree very much that that is the sort of investigation that needs to be undertaken. But even if there is unfettered access, et cetera, and the months that will be required to undertake this kind of examination does take place, at the end of the day, the WHO is owned and operated by the sovereign states of the United Nations, one of which is China, and a very important one at that. And so where I get concerned is that the word independent is simply not really accurate. This is not an independent organization nor an independent investigation.
Professor Chen, perhaps I should bring you in here. Do you agree that the Wuhan laboratory should be a place that we can go into and investigate, just to put to bed these sorts of questions?
There's no such thing as China trying to prevent the world from accessing the Wuhan Institute of Virology. There's all complete openness for China. It is all open.
I need to make the point that there is enormous scientific support for the theory that the coronavirus occurred naturally, having passed from bats to another animal, possibly a pangolin, transported to Wuhan, and then made the leap to humans in a wet market where wildlife is sold as food. But what is puzzling for scientists is it's now known that many of the first COVID-19 victims were not connected to the market in Wuhan, where it was first thought the virus emerged.
I don't think the wet market is the origin of the pandemic because the first 2 cases hadn't been to the wet market from the Wuhan cluster, and half of the cases in that cluster had not been to the wet market.
And despite extensive testing, no trace of the COVID-19 virus was found in the animals that were sold at the market.
They went to the wet market, they took samples, they took environmental samples, but none of those samples showed a coronavirus in the animals that were sampled. So at Huanan Seafood Market, there's no animal samples that we know of that have a SARS coronavirus that could be an ancestor to what we see today and that has infected the world, essentially.
But if the issue of how the pandemic began wasn't already held hostage to global politics, When COVID-19 hit the US, first decimating New York, the scientific debate about the origin of the virus was also hijacked by politics, by none other than America's denier-in-chief.
Because of the Chinese virus, what happened about 3 months ago, it looked like we were in big trouble, and we were, and I got it back together.
The discussion about China's role in the pandemic was distorted and to a large extent derailed by the blame game so enthusiastically enforced by former American President Donald Trump.
The China virus, the China plague, Kung flu. The doctors would say, well...
Did Trump's rhetoric impede conversation about any alternative in the world of COVID and how it might have come about?
Absolutely. You know, scientifically, I think the minute Trump blurted out that he'd read a report that said this could be a laboratory leak, I guess the scientific establishment then said, well, if Trump said that, we have to drive the opposite agenda to prove that Trump doesn't know what he's talking about. Trump may not know what he's talking about, but I think there was this counterattack by saying, well, if we can discredit him for saying that, we can discredit him for a lot of other things. So it was unfortunate that he even came into the debate.
The unwarranted accusation made by the US on hearsay evidence against China is irresponsible and disregards the facts and even hides ulterior motives.
Science got caught up in the politics and everything seemingly was thrown out the window.
It's correct to say that because of Trump's idea, sort of vocalising the lab leak theory as his own, he basically pushed all those people to say, hold up, we need to stop this. Trump's going to go on this tangent, start claiming China that is making bioweapons or whatever it is. And Trump's idea of the leak got tied in with an actual legitimate investigation that needs to take place with the laboratory.
There's nothing positive about what happened in China having to do with...
China reacted angrily and it seems punitively against anyone who questioned it. And an example of that is when Australia called for an independent international inquiry into the origins of the virus.
It would seem entirely reasonable and sensible that the world would want to have an independent assessment of how this all occurred.
In China's view, Prime Minister Scott Morrison was already in the camp of Donald Trump, and his call came hot on the heels of Trump's inflammatory rhetoric.
I think that there should be an independent inquiry, but, you know, did we, Australia, need to lead it? How we went about it? I read somewhere that, you know, we'd just gotten off the phone from Trump and then we went public, so it just looked bad. It looked like a political setup.
I think actually in China, you know, people in China feel that Australia has been joining with the United States to bully China, not the other way around. Repeatedly, we see a lot of instances in which Australia has been initiating uninvited attacks upon China as a way to joining forces, as I said, with the United States to pose this attack on China.
Coming up,
somehow this is their fault, and they need to bear responsibility.
Secret cameras in Wuhan. Final proof of a cover-up from the beginning.
Why did the world not take this seriously? Because they were misinformed.
That's next on Under Investigation.
Because of the Chinese virus, what happened about 3 months ago, it looked like we were in big trouble, and we were, and I got it back together.
Former US President Donald Trump almost single-handedly derailed any serious scientific debate about the possibility that the COVID-19 virus could have leaked from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Even though the lab's chief scientist, Ji Zhengli, admitted her team was studying a closely related bat virus that killed 3 miners 8 years before the pandemic struck.
I've read the medical thesis, and both the patient's symptoms, the course of the disease says these miners were infected with a coronavirus.
There continue to be questions over whether the World Health Organization is the right group to lead an independent investigation into the origin of COVID-19.
The word independent is simply not really accurate. This is not an independent organization nor an independent investigation.
There is also concern about the controversial genetic engineering technique called gain of function, which the Wuhan lab was engaged in to create lethal human viruses.
I'm just so disturbed that this goes on, and I don't think it should go on, because we are engineering a virus that could wipe out humankind.
And there is still the question about what Chinese authorities knew about the disease and when they knew it.
There is a view in the West that China covered up or at best downplayed the seriousness of the virus outbreak. That contention has been forcefully and at times angrily denied by China, with some officials saying the suggestion borders on racism.
这就是定点医院的现状，没有任何人管。
But we've obtained footage shot in Wuhan that seems to support an early cover-up by China.
As the virus took hold in late December 2019, doctors were silenced and disciplined. And one of the first to express his concerns, Dr. Li Wenliang, was threatened with arrest and later died from the virus. At great personal risk, a citizen journalist in Wuhan covertly filmed these interviews with senior medical professionals. They say from the very beginning, there was no doubt the virus was spreading from human to human.
12月知道我原来带过一个学生，他的哥哥就是在12月底吧，是一个月初10得这个病。当时第一批卫健委来的时候呢，他屋里其他人也都感染了，还不得，包括我的学生有小朋友。
Those doctors reveal that Chinese authorities ordered them to lie about how quickly and easily the virus spread.
他会还是真的吗？比如说他们那个时候他会，就是卫健委要求你或是排查他们那些你啊，或者就是那个甚至有的人就是可能说你自然而然就行了嘛。知道，大家知道。
And they say authorities allowed Chinese Lunar New Year celebrations to proceed, knowing the health risks.
按说这个时候应该举行这个人群的密集的大型活动，让大家都贴这一些。你当时你让你身为你肯定知道这个事情的，你身为也知道这个事，你还是在举报它。
Professor Chen, from everything we see, China did downplay this virus from the beginning. Do you agree with that?
At the very beginning of the outbreak in Wuhan, people were simply, taken by surprise, and people were simply, not understanding the nature of the virus, of the disease, and also how it spread. There was not a deliberate top-down attempt to cover up, because at the time China was under this kind of surprise attack from the totally unknown virus.
There do seem to be, though, some harsh examples of those who wanted to speak being told that they couldn't, being warned, being imprisoned.
I should say that that was also a kind of response from the local level, because at the time people were simply panicking. So we should not be interpreting this kind of act as a kind of a nefarious, deliberate, malicious act to cover the incident up.
I think we need to remember that there's Chinese who are in the ministries who I have always found to be very interested in exactly what's going on. But then there may be minor officials who don't want to be the bearer of bad tidings, and they may also have prevented China from talking to WHO early on. So there are two Chinas. There's the local authorities that didn't respond fast enough, and then there's the Beijing authorities. And the local authorities should have acted faster.
I want to go one step back. Why did the world not take this seriously? Because they were misinformed.
I don't believe that.
Well,
I
hang
don't
on.
think...
Why? Can I ask? Where are you going? Are you suggesting that they were misinformed by whom?
About the seriousness of the virus.
By whom?
By the official Chinese government information that was being provided to WHO and the rest of the world that said initially this wasn't a human transmissible virus, that there were only limited number of cases in Wuhan. We now know that both of those things were completely incorrect, that they knew it was transmissible at the same time as the rest of the world were being told, in fact, through WHO, this is not a human-to-human transmissible virus.
I think this is quite unfair to say that actually China was deliberately withholding the fact that actually there was a human-to-human infection, because it was actually quite timely, because actually the Chinese authorities and also local experts were actually really studying the cases. So actually this is really a step-by-step process to determine the nature of a totally unknown disease.
This is an extremely sensitive issue in China. Why? Because China itself is trying to demonstrate to the world that it's a responsible power, that its emergence on the international scene should be seen as legitimate and acceptable. It's something that China wants the world to embrace. So you add all that together and you can see why on the one hand, they would want to be extremely careful in shaping what the world hears. And on the other hand, being extremely sensitive and defensive to any suggestion from the outside that somehow this is their fault.
The pandemic for me was this utter failure in the ideal of international cooperation. It wasn't an alien invasion, but it was kind of like an alien invasion, right? Where you'd think that all the countries of the world would come together and there'd be a multinational force to fight the enemy. But it didn't happen. Instead, what we saw was international bickering, finger-pointing, blame shifting because of geopolitics.
I would add to that, Jason, that COVID-19 simply intensified what was already well in motion. And so you pour gasoline basically onto that burning fire of an alien invasion, and it just exacerbates the whole problem.
Coming up, will we ever know the source of the virus?
Was it a natural accident or was it a lab accident?
Rarely does someone who's committed the murder say, I did it.
That's next on Under Investigation.
We began tonight's debate asking, could this pandemic have been caused by a leak from the Wuhan lab, which until recently was considered a conspiracy theory? And has China's other actions during this last terrible year been rightly condemned? Or are we guilty of a global blame game?
What our experts agree on is this. There are legitimate questions the world still needs answers to about the origins of the virus. And that includes the role, if any, played by the bat virus that killed 3 copper miners 8 years before the pandemic. Legitimate questions, too, about the research carried out by the Wuhan Institute of Virology and its use of controversial genetic engineering that can create deadly viruses inside a lab.
If we are engineering a virus that could wipe out humankind, it is literally like we're building the Death Star, and if something goes wrong, then everybody dies.
It's to be decided whether the World Health Organization, soon to release its final report into the origin of the virus, can be trusted to carry out an independent investigation.
Where I get concerned is that the word independent is simply not really accurate. This is not an independent organization nor an independent investigation.
And there are still doubts as to whether China is as determined as the rest of the world in finding out where the virus came from and how it turned into a pandemic.
If the virus is out there in nature, ultimately we should find it. The longer it takes and we don't find it, the more we have to think it came from somewhere else. Similarly, unless someone, puts their hand up and says, mea culpa, I was culturing that virus and somehow it leaked out, we're going to end up with a probability, like we do even in criminal law cases. Rarely does someone who's committed the murder say, I did it.
Oh, look, I agree. What I don't agree is about the blame, about how it was done politically. We all want to know what might have occurred so that it can be prevented, because we will get another pandemic.
Well, today we have been talking a lot about hypotheses, about a leakage, about the origin of the virus. But the most important thing, I think, is concrete, step-by-step research.
Whatever happened here was accidental. There's no evidence that China tried to manipulate or release any virus into the population. So we have to think of it as an accident. Was it a natural accident or was it a lab accident?
I don't care how many scientists step up and say, it was this. This is the reason. We have definitive proof. There's going to be people out there that simply will not accept it, and perhaps even for geopolitical reasons not do so.
Even if the WHO says...
Maybe even more so.
I'd say we may not ever get to how it really started, but what we've really learnt is the importance of how you respond. The real tension in all of this for me is this choice between cooperation and conflict. And my hope that what we can learn from this is that choosing to cooperate is always a better path than choosing to have a big fight.
For all of the questions we've discussed here tonight, there is the hope that soon they will be questions of history, and that the question of where the virus came from will become less important than how we finally defeated it. Thank you all very much for joining me. I'm Liz Hayes. Good night. Hello, I'm Liz Hayes. Thanks for watching our brand new event series, Under Investigation. Subscribe to our channel now for more great stories from both Under Investigation and 60 Minutes Australia. For other exclusive Under Investigation content, visit 9now.com.au and the 9Now app.